Hello, everybody. This is Tara Boothby, Sojourn Psychology, Tony Zerbin, Sojourn Psychology.
Been a minute.
It's been a minute. You know what? So this is our series conversation for restoration, but for some people, you might be watching because you are a traditional Sojourn person. And so Tony and I have a long history of blogging together. We have over 40, but Tony had a lot of academic pursuits. So it's been a minute.
Hmm.
And then Tony's one of my favorite people to nerd out on the interface of psychology and theology.
Hmm. Lord have mercy.
Yeah, Lord have mercy if there was ever a relevant prayer, right?
Well, I mean, I've
Uh,
seen people make a disclaimer before, which I think is totally relevant for me to make. And it's, I'm talking about things that are big, that are ancient, and any mistakes I make are my own. I'll do my best to represent as I go, but whether it's with psychological practice or this, I have to own my own mistakes, but I'll do them in good faith.
Beautiful, beautiful. And too, I think like you and I so often we're talking about what we're seeing is people coming in, lots of institutional trauma, lots of spiritual abuse.
Hmm.
And so part of the passion of this project is like uh, the world of psychology needs some of that theological, the love theology, maybe we could call it.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting. So you have a term for psychologists that you
Which,
call well, I've heard you call us the secular priests.
yes. Okay. Well, I was wondering if you were going to go there.
You're like,
It's an
not
interesting.
assholes, Tony, not assholes.
It's a funny thing to frame. This is very much something that came up in my time in my undergrad. I had a really oh, this is a good word, a bombastic professor. He got himself into trouble with the department a few times because he was willing to say interesting things. And some of them might even have been true. I don't know. We'll find out. But, or maybe we won't. But he had a thing that he really led us through that was very eye-opening for me. And it was about the development of the ideas of psychology from its beginning until present day. And our term project was to take one idea, one intervention, one concept, and see where it came from and how it developed throughout the history of the practice of psychology. And me being curious as I am, and me being a person that's grown up in a context of the Christian faith, I was like, well, let's see how far back we can trace these ideas. Do they predate psychology even? And one of the things I discovered is that the modern Western practice of psychology comes onto the scene right around the same time. I maybe need to check my receipts to see how closely, but right around the same time that the dominant versions of confessional Christianity stop being so common. So things like um, especially in the West, Roman Catholicism and Anglicanism and Lutheranism, I think even has some of their churches do confession regularly as a practice. But later in the Reformation and going into the 1700s, 1800s, you have the upsurge of low church Christianity, like the kind that I grew up with, which was very much simple Bible believing, holiness movement. We don't need a clerical system above us. We're all in it together, and it's me and Jesus, which is really lovely. And some of those churches do some really interesting things around confession, but the formality of it disappeared.
Mm.
So I've been talking just personally with priests I know, with different pastors and such. And the priests in particular, when I learn more about the practice of confession, which is new to me, it looks similar. It's not the same, but it looks similar to the practice that we as psychologists do,
Yeah.
right? And it's worth pausing on the word psychology for a moment and saying this is the study of the soul, if you translate it.
The
It's
study
right
of the
in the name.
soul.
Psychology. It's right there.
Ah,
Nerding out, right?
you're one of my favorite nerds. I love it. I love nerding out with you. Wow, Tony, right? And it's interesting because, you know, you're talking about this bombastic teacher. And I remember in high school, and I'm a Gen Xer, so I'm in high school in the 90s, and everybody who might have been LGBTQ plus was pretty closeted. So I
Hmm.
had
Yeah.
this one high school teacher, English teacher. I adored him. He's great. Back then we would have called him flamboyant. I didn't know
Hmm.
what that meant, but I was pretty sure my tradition wanted me to judge him for it.
Mm.
Um, I love the man. Anyhow, in class one day, he said, I don't get these religious people, especially the ones like these, the Christians that go to just the churches where you don't have confession. If I was a Christian, at least I'd be a Catholic because then I'd have confession. And
Interesting.
I remember being offended because I should be, because confession is probably wrong in my tradition that I was raised in, and
Yeah.
also being gobsmacked because it actually made sense. So,
Yeah.
but the loss of confession and the development of the room for I guess modern confession. We get rid of the traditional spiritual confession and we
Yeah.
need it.
Yeah.
So we
For
reinvent
better and for
it.
worse. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. So we're sort of this like the modern or the secular priest.
Yeah.
And that's the interface for you and I because we are the secular priests, but then we are also in love with with what the priesthood means for
Hmm.
us.
Hmm. Yeah.
That's an interesting balance for people like you and I.
Oh, I mean, anytime I talk about balance in general with clients, whether it's the physical somatic balance or otherwise, balance is always moving.
Yes.
We're limited, and the only thing that's perfectly still is the thing that's dead. So we're always trying to find balance. We're always relatively more or less in balance, but it's living and dynamic.
Yeah. So let me ask you a big, bold question, and you can answer it as much as you want or how you want. Yeah. Um, how did you sort of like, how do you tell the story of your love discovery?
Love discovery.
Well, I mean, I don't know, like spiritual things or just the transform. I've known you since I think it was 2001. We've known each other for a long time.
Whoa, just did the math on that.
Yeah, it's like
That's a
almost
long time.
it will be 14 years and we both have changed so much. So that's what I say. Like over 14 years, I have bared witness to what I call your love discovery.
Okay. Okay. Ah, okay.
Two
Okay.
psychologists is what we do. We're like, could you make that more explicit? Could you just say that a different way? This is what we do.
Oh, absolutely. Because I can go off on tangents, but I want to make sure I get the question.
Mm,
Um, it's always been for me a really integrative thing. And it starts always at the level of I see people hurting and I say, I don't like that. I mean, hurt's always information, right? Pain is always information, and I don't like eliminating pain until we've understood why it's there.
mhm.
But I've seen a lot of people really struggle in life with a lot of pain, and some of it looked a lot like spiritual abuse, right? And some of it looked a lot like sometimes an absence of any kind of spiritual presence, right? And that's even itself quite broad. But when I see people suffering, I'm moved by compassion to try to meet them
Mm.
and in suffering with them, uh, meet both of our suffering in something that draws us closer, which is, I don't know how else to slice it. It's inherently spiritual, right? Across traditions, that's inherently spiritual. Um, and there's times where the answers in psychology are really useful. And then there's times where they're so wrapped up in materialism and empiricism and so distant that they're dissociated from the human experience.
Wow.
Right? And I've had
Yes.
clients that come in and say, don't give me the I don't care about the dry like papers and research studies. Sure, you can throw the facts at me and it's part of your job and you're supposed to, but I'm also a human that's suffering right now, and that what does that have to do with me?
Mm.
And I go, oh man, what is my scope here? Because I'm not a pastor, not spiritually a pastor. I have my own faith tradition, but how do I show up in a way that actually is healing for where that person is at and not be 5 steps ahead of them or off in left field?
Yeah, or abusive, like if we're too
Which is
far
abusive.
ahead or
Yeah.
too far parallel,
Yeah.
or we have a misinformed view
Yeah.
of if we believe in us and them, if we see like a lot of misconstrued or problematic religiosity is
Yeah.
that there's an inclusive club here
Yeah.
and I have to know who's in and who's out. I mean, that doesn't work in our field.
It's totally antithetical to our work. Our work has nothing to do with insidering, outsidering, as best I understand it.
No,
So
me neither. And I mean,
it's like how can I like saying to clients, it's like how can we help each other be more human,
yeah,
more whole?
yes, yeah, I love this. And so I'm curious, and it always just evolves as it does when you and I speak together. Me landing in attachment theory transformed my view of God, and I really believe that I found out who God was.
Mm.
And you're a somatic therapist
Mm.
and in the bodynamics world. So
Mm.
how does first off, what is somatic
Yeah.
therapy, and how has that improved the God or your view of the God that you know?
Yeah. No, those are good questions.
I'm in
So
the biz. I'm in the biz.
so first order of business, what is somatic? It's the Greek word soma, which just means body, right? And the reason we have to actually specify the somatic psychologist is because some disciplines in psychology do nothing or very little of anything formal with the body. And I mean, those guys do great work. I've seen clinicians that do fantastic work that I'd love to learn from in basically every modality I've encountered. But what made a difference for me in my own therapy and to the second part of your question is that I experienced life through my body. I like to say when I was young, I am lactose intolerant. And my first clue that I ate something that wasn't good for me, that had dairy in it, wasn't physical distress. The precursor to it was actually the emotional distress of physical distress that I hadn't become aware of yet.
Wow. Hey.
And that really strongly impacted me to realize that the state of what happens or doesn't happen in the body has a huge impact in what emerges as thought life. Because thoughts happen to us. And there's days where I wish I could think good thoughts, but everything else is set up in such a way that the easiest thoughts, the ones that emerge the most, the crop I'm growing is weeds, is all these thoughts that are just uh, dysfunctional and destructive.
Yeah. Yeah. The
Mhm.
body
Fastest
keeps
way
the
there is
score.
give me some cheese.
Yeah, well, and you think, and it's like this is not hooey. This is truth that the body keeps the score. So
Yes.
if
Yeah.
if we don't listen to it, Freud. I mean, Freud is Freud. He's
Yeah.
Freud, but he said some smart things. That's why he's one of the fathers of psychology.
Yeah.
If you don't let anger out one way, it'll come out some other way. If we're
Yeah.
distressed physically, food is not good for me, and I'm not embodied.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then my
Yeah.
body is going to try to send me a signal whatever way it can.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So to your second question, um, so I mean, my context is the Christian faith, and more than most other faiths I've ever encountered, I can't say I've encountered them all, but the Christian faith is really based in the body, which is controversial in some corners. I know I've looked around a bunch. There's a lot of ancient Greek folk religion that snuck into modern Christianity, and it's always been the risk. But this whole separation of mind and body, and we're gonna leave this earthly coil behind, and one day I'll fly away, and all this kind of stuff, this separation of the body, period, with that period there, isn't a Christian belief. It's an ancient Gnostic secret religion belief. The Christian belief is God became man so that man can become like God, and that in the end of all things will be made new, like restored, not recreated, but like restored. And it lands in Genesis where God looks at all things he's made and says, these are very good.
Mm,
Man with a body is very good. And Christ weeps when body and soul are separated. At the tomb of
mm,
Lazarus, Christ weeps because this wasn't the whole picture. So when we talk dismissively about the body, it's actually not the fullness of a Christian faith. It's common, maybe possibly the most common understanding of Christian faith, but it's not consistent with the fullness of what I've seen in Scripture.
yeah.
So in giving the body that great honor through Christ first, but then through how we honor our bodies and work with our bodies so that they actually support us in having a good thought life and good relationships. That's been a journey to get there, but it's the only thing that makes sense with my
I
experience so far.
I agree. And it's some of the spiritual abuse as well for traditional conservative North American Christians that we'll talk about the body of Christ. I'm a part of the body of Christ in this very two-dimensional way. And then the trauma experiences, so often we're not embodied.
Yeah.
We're not fully
Yes.
in our dwelling. And that it's such an irony
Yeah.
of the disconnect with institutional trauma. Perform, have the answers, do better, be in or go to hell, and all
Mhm.
of that abuse of being disconnected into just having this formula, all of this stuff that just makes like no sense psychologically, scientifically, theoretically. um yeah, so spiritual abuse, how do you define spiritual abuse? I
Good
didn't tell you I
question.
was going to ask you that.
No, I mean it's actually probably one of the genesis behind me ever getting into this profession. Um, as I sit currently with it, it's any form of abuse that exists that's done in the name of the divine.
Ah,
So it can be physical, it can be emotional, it can be existential, it can be sexual, any form of abuse that is put in the context of this is your experience of eternity. God condones this or even wills it,
yeah.
and it's something that's for the destruction of people. Or I'm going to take advantage of you in the name of God. That's not Christ giving himself. It's
And
quite
that's a
the opposite.
person. It's a person saying that.
So
I am deciding for the divine that this is okay.
this is the heart of the commandment of don't take the Lord's name in vain. It doesn't say saying, "Oh, Jesus." It's not that. It's you call yourself a Christian, and if you act in a way other than Christ, you bear the name. You do violence to the name.
Yes.
So because at with the, I heard a priest say once, you only ever encounter God in the present. And if you look at the great commandment, it's love God and love your neighbor. But for most of us, the only thing we know about God is the people who carry his name and how they
Mm,
act or don't act. So what they do in the body has a huge impact on us spiritually and socially and emotionally and physically.
yeah.
There's no separation. The only separation that exists of mind and body and soul is in textbooks.
Yeah. And I think my I love this, Tony. Like this is just, all the Pentecostals and the great cloud of witnesses are just going, come on, preach. But it is like my love discovery right now where I'm at, and some of it's brand new, is it's like love God, love your neighbor as love yourself. Love the stranger is this brand new, beautiful part.
Stranger who is your brother and your flesh, as Isaiah says.
Oh, you know,
Like the stranger is your flesh.
yeah.
And who hates his own flesh? I mean, it's more complex, but it's
The
that.
stranger is your flesh, and who eats their own flesh. That is powerful to contemplate on. And then, so that kind of segues in, well, that's a huge sweep of violence and othering, but it's also speaks to institutional trauma.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so I'll say, like, in my current sort of metaphor of my involvement in institutional trauma was I was drinking the Kool-Aid, but I was also serving the Kool-Aid.
Yep.
And so that's the pain. I was victimized and hurt and abused by institutional trauma, but I contributed. And I've used the word participate, but it's not quite participating because it's not spiritually wise. And we often use the word participate. There's a tone of spiritual wisdom, of kenosis.
Mm.
Um, but I contributed. I was
Mhm.
drinking the Kool-Aid and I was serving it.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
How do you define institutional trauma, or how do you notice it from your own experience, your former tradition, or your
So let me layer this up because I'm going to start concrete in somatic way, I guess you could say. But one of the ways we cope internally with things that are too big for us is we cut ourselves off from them, which is why we lose parts, if not the whole of our body in our experience. Um, and if we have help from somebody else, it's easier to stay in our body with the big things. Bowen talks about this, about triangulating anxiety. If you have a third person, then the couple can be more stable. Be that a
yeah.
kid, a pastor, or sometimes another partner, like whatever it is. We have these efforts to triangulate, to stabilize, right? The quintessential baby saves the marriage, although that doesn't really work quite like that, but
Don't have a miracle baby.
um, but this starts personally, and then it builds out into the family, and then the family builds out into the clan. But one of the things we've done innovatively is we've created institutions as a way of splitting off the self from the broader context of family. And we try to talk about corporations and institutions and these kinds of things. And they're done, they're rather soulless, and they also separate us from each other. I mean, if you're making like water bottles or whatever, it's like, okay, it's functional. We all can bear with the just small levels of cognitive dissonance and dysfunction. But there really is a sense like we talk about corporate culture and all these kinds of things. And culture really is what we do and don't do in families, right? So when I talk about institutional trauma, it's the nameless, personless things that are done on behalf of the entity that is the institution, which nobody can pinpoint exactly who is acting as the institution. It displaces humanity, but it bears the weight of this is the group,
Wow.
right? This is the family. And if the family functionally, like this is how we relate to it, if the family cuts me out or disciplines me, then I'm cut out from my tribe, my people, my family, my clan. And I mean, ancient cultures, the best way to talk about somebody getting a death sentence was to say they were cut off from their people,
Hmm.
because you're as good as dead without your people. Our whole emotion of shame, it's really useful, or it can be, is is given to us in a sense to help us know the bounds of the group. But if the group's not healthy, how can our shame be healthy?
Yeah. If the group's not healthy, how can our shame be healthy? And then the silent, powerful voice. I think that's such an important piece, especially in distressing political climates and when people are starting to feel uncomfortable in the institution, whether that's a system, a government job or a hospital job, but also the church. The church institution is the silent voice. And
Yes.
subconsciously, where does our brain go to when it's like there's some voice of reason here that I can't see? I'm
Mhm.
uncomfortable with it, the invisible voice.
Mhm.
And so there's a natural, well, dilemma.
Mhm.
Do I trust? Do I go with the flow? Is this God? Isn't this God? It's very confusing. Institutional
Yeah.
trauma is very, very confusing.
The facelessness of it, the depersonalization of it, um,
Mm-hmm.
that's I mean, that's where so much of the pain can really set in, right? Like we need distribution of roles. Hierarchies can be really useful, but if nobody can be held accountable face to face, if there isn't somebody who takes some level of responsibility for what's done and as part of the institution, if there is no recourse for actual damage that happens for people, that's how I see institutional violence.
Yes. Oh my word. I just feel like I'm repeating institutional violence. I'm like,
But
but
if it's in the context of a family, it's different. Because then it can be like, well, it's like my brother hurt me, and I can talk to my brother or I can talk to my dad. And my dad knows my brother. And my dad also has a different layer of authority to deal with my brother if my brother won't deal with me. But there's a face that's happening there. Whereas it's you receive an anonymous, institutionally stamped letter from an institution. It's like, well, who do I talk to? Who's ultimately responsible there?
yeah, or try to talk to them. Right nowadays, the facelessness is so much more increased. And there's this relationalness. And so we can talk about a philosophy, we can be preached to about the body of Christ, the body of Christ, the body of Christ, and then be in a system, an institution that is not living as a body, and there's a faceless authority that is spiritually abusing potentially, or corrupt on whatever level, because the system's always corrupt, because people's ways are, our highways are not the highways. We're
We're
not
limited.
God.
No, exactly.
And we're
We're
trying to
not
help.
God.
We're trying to help. And oh wow, so many things here. um so I was curious. Okay, so this is what I wanted to say, because you're my favorite person to talk about shame with.
Hmm.
And when we're thinking about it through this lens, like here's this beautiful place that I belong to. And I loved my church upbringing. It was beautiful. I think
Yeah.
you loved yours too.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's hard to
Most of it.
change, most of it. And it's hard to change. And I was talking to a friend, Jonathan Puddle, and he's like, people exit or deconstruct, and it's such a brave thing, but they're often called heretics, or they're just like othered by their faith community. And so it's this strangeness when we are trying to be closer to God, to be brave and discover a nonviolent, loving place, to have a triune God, and like all of these things that are important points of contemplation. They're good for our mental health, but you move out into loving God better,
Yeah.
and the 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 institution stops talking to you.
Yeah. 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 Well,
And
the institution.
yeah,
There's a saying in the business world, and it's of the people I've seen in business, it's mostly true. It's not entirely true, as any general statement is, but it's usually people quit managers more than they quit jobs,
yep.
right? And it's mostly true. It's not entirely true. But it's also, I mean, that's the same thing I've seen in my broad survey of churches in at least the greater Edmonton area, is when I talk with people from a variety of traditions, when I check out a variety of traditions, um, the first thing people usually talk about is, and for better and for worse, there's not one way or that's better or worse, but people don't usually leave churches, strictly speaking, because of theology.
No.
We can usually bear a lot of gaps and holes and dysfunctions in our theology if feel we are being seen.
Hmm.
But you can have a place that's got amazing, beautiful theology, and if people do not feel seen, they're gonna walk.
Yeah. Or like me. Like I get to like me in all of my relationships. And the last evangelical church that I was really active in, the last conversation, yeah, I was upset with what was being said to me and what wasn't.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I also was just like, didn't like me. And it was not about God or theology or disagreement or anything. I was just like, gross. I don't like me. I don't like that. I don't feel safe to have
Hmm.
been seen in that way. And it wasn't
Yeah.
fighting or anything. Um, but too, I think it's this other thing when you talk about people quit managers, because I'm the boss. I don't like being the boss.
Mm.
But I'll say like 90 to 95% of the people who have left Sojourn,
Hmm.
it's great. And I, it's
You can develop.
fine. I'm
Yeah.
fine with people leaving. And sometimes like endings are always hard and they're not always good.
Yeah. They always bring
Um,
things. That's normal. That's fine.
but it's like, I think that's part of this church culture where I want the best for everybody who's been here and who has moved on. And some people, it's been harder to figure out how to want the best for them, but
Yeah.
because I'm a person, but it's this pain, I think, of trusting when we believe that there's a them and there's an us. It's really hard to trust when people are leaving. But the
Yeah.
person who leaves is often left holding this shame pouch of like, I'm outside.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nobody's calling me. Nobody's texting me.
Yeah.
Nobody's asking me if I'm being spiritually fed. And I'm
Yeah.
I'm at the table, baby.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's beautiful, but nobody's asking me if I'm at the table.
No, and I mean, I've seen a lot of that too, where it's just like, man, too many thoughts to sort through. Because I mean, there's so much there. It brings up so much. This is distinctly the experience I'm thinking of, even when we talk about being seen, right?
Mhm.
And I like that you brought a sojourn because that's a different, there's nice delineation there. I've got to have wonderful colleagues that uh, left after I arrived or that came and then moved on. Like that's where I was hedging, saying there's a sadness in saying goodbye, but it's not a lack of being seen. It's a go on and develop. It's not, this is your experience, so correct me if I'm wrong. I'm imagining a little bit here, but it's a little bit like raising kids and saying, "Oh man, you're going out to conquer the world. I'm
Yeah.
so proud of you, but you're not in the house anymore."
Yeah.
And we're not
Except,
out of connection the same way.
yeah. And yeah, it's similar and different. But I appreciate that. Like, I mean, Sojourn's my oldest child, is how I will say.
Yeah, yeah,
So
I can
there's,
believe that.
the family surrounding my angsty teenager at this point and guarding the relationships between my big baby Sojourn
Yeah,
and the people that are in connection to Sojourn.
yeah,
But it is very similar. And I mean, it's the institution. And I mean, I in leadership, I have hurt people.
yeah,
Leadership hurts people. The
yeah,
church hurts
yeah.
people. I get
It
that.
does.
I have served the Kool-Aid.
Yeah. What it does next, though, I think is so profound. Because I mean, this is why I love and have devoted so much of my time to deepening my understanding and working with shame in particular. Because um, it's a profound provocation to growth.
Mm.
it shows us our edges, it shows us our limits, and it says, what are you gonna do next? Because you can do the beautiful thing. The beautiful thing is going, oh shit, I really screwed up.
Yeah.
Or I screwed up a little bit, or I screwed up really big. Doesn't even matter. It sucks. We don't ever want it to happen. But when I can say, oh man, I really screwed up. I see how it impacted you. If I can fix it, I'm going to, restitution. And most of the time we can't actually fix it. Restitution is great, but restitution is not the whole picture. Because what happens after that too is all the energy I get from motion, from shame, I pour back into developing myself and proving to you that the way I
Mm.
screwed up isn't going to happen again. Maybe I'll screw up another way and I'll have shame about it then. But this moment between me and you face to face is me owning my screw up with you specifically. A priest I really love, he has just had wonderful writing, and I hope one day to meet him. Had this wonderful little turn of phrase. He said, that's just been so impactful for me. And he says, salvation is specific. And in his context, it's also so much in this therapeutic lens of growth and healing and restoration. And this is really a point that more clinically I try to work with clients is this thing out here happened and I'm hurt, and it's like, no, 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 no. This happened between you and somebody else.
Yeah.
And while it was done in the name of the institution isn't strictly speaking going to be healing. There's contexts there. But the most healing thing is when somebody comes in the name of the institution and says, hey, I represent the institution. I have pull and influence with the institution. I carry part of the name of the institution.
Yeah.
And you were hurt, maybe even by me. Forgive me, and I'm going to do what I can to set it right with you.
Yeah.
Because until that, here's a psychology term, restorative emotional experience happens, we're still gonna carry our hurt. There's so much work I can't do with clients because I'm not an institution.
Whenever possible, right? And then you think of like part of the problem with, because I mean, with me, and I'm aware of everybody who's worked at Sojourn because we're not huge, right?
Yeah.
So I know the people who are really hurt by me and who I'm really hurt by.
Mhm.
And I think amends whenever possible, unless to do so would cause harm to others or myself. So it's
Yep.
complicated. I
Yeah.
grieve
Yeah.
being out of relationship, even
Oh
toxic
yeah.
relationships, work or otherwise. Nevertheless, I'm aware and I'm contemplating, and it hurts me, even though I
Yeah.
don't necessarily know how to step in or would. I don't think
And
there's some I won't. There's some I won't.
yep.
Um,
Yep.
but with the church, when you have a super church, when the shepherd does not know the name of his sheep, the Benedictine monk code is like, no, know the people.
Mhm.
So you have 10 exit, 50 exit, 150 exit. What's happening
And
to my congregation?
the first time you notice is in the offering line. You're like, oh, we received a little less money. What happened?
Yeah, all
That,
these
well,
people that I was
hmm.
caring for that I didn't know who they were. Well, yeah, so it's problematic. It's really problematic. It speaks to the institutional nature and how we've constructed churches in North America, the evangelical or whatever we're going to call them. We can see the problematic nature and why it's happening.
Mhm.
Um, okay, so shame.
Mhm.
When we start to what I call do a love discovery, when we start to want to grow and mature as spiritual beings, maybe that starts by going to see a therapist and working on our mental well-being or our relationships, and we want to keep growing forward.
Yeah.
But then so often people who are really trying to mature spiritually are shamed.
Yeah. Okay. Ooh, there's a lot to unpack there. Um, I mean, if I show my cards, I really like and appreciate shame, which is probably really hard for a lot of people to hear. Um, when I first started doing this work, to really put it into context, when I first started doing this work, um, one of the things I was really interested in was learning about trauma. And the two bellwethers, the two big flags of lurking trauma are the existence of anxiety and depression. And depression, as I understand it, the majority of the work I've done with depression that's really made a difference for people has usually always been around conversations about owning the shame that's yours and getting rid of the shame that's not, and
Mm.
differentiating between the two, right? And when we own the shame that's ours, and it's not ever equal in trauma, ever, ever. Sometimes it's 1 in 99, right? And it can be that one can be the same kind of shame that happens when you stub your toe. It's like, oh, the physiology gets activated, but it's not, you stubbed your toe. You did that wrong. Like it's 1%, right? There's the physiology of shame versus like the morality of shame. I want to distinguish those two. But I really love shame because Um, the worst trauma a person can experience. No, that's a hell of a thing to say. Let me couch that very differently. One of the most painful traumas people experience is humiliation,
Yes.
right? And that shows up in the brain the same way car accidents can show up in the brain, the same way any kind of abuse can show up physically in brain scans. Humiliation, bullying can show up in the brain scans too. It literally changes the structure of your brain. That's how impactful humiliation is. It's the extreme experience of shame. And it's usually done at the hands of people that represent something important to you, be it a family, an institution, your friends, a teacher, something, you name it, right? Now that's the extreme end of the destructive side of shame. But then you have other parts of it. Humility. It's great. Humility is wonderful. Humility is what allows our society to actually work. Is I
Yeah.
know my place and I can do the appropriate handoff. I know me, not me. I know who I work for. I know who works for me. And we can actually function that way. And
Yeah.
without humility, things become really dysfunctional. I'm not going to make any comments about politics.
It's so dangerous.
No, I'm not going to go there. I'm already talking about religion. Let's not throw politics in. Um, but then you also have shyness and embarrassment. And
Mhm.
those are appropriate. It's how we get a feel for what's happening in a group and how to really find the soft edges of it and how to gently put ourselves out there and really explore. That's really important. But then physiology of shame, it also shows up in other ways. And I'll link this back to trauma. If we can have one experience that is a brief and life-altering, impactful experience that produces something that's on the whole dysfunctional and negative in us, is it possible to have the inverse of that? Is it possible
Mm.
to have one brief, life-altering experience that produces in us something that's profoundly useful and functional, humanizing, if you will? And everywhere I've looked, I've come to the conclusion at this point in my career and my work and my development that that also still happens in shame. Because gratitude,
Hmm.
part of shame, and if you don't believe me, just think about people who do anything possible to avoid being put in the place of needing to be grateful
Oh yeah.
because it's so dang awkward, which is shame. Or look at what happens when people encounter something authentically beautiful.
Hmm.
Not airbrushed, not marketed, but like something that's outside of you, so beyond you, and so beautiful. Because what happens first is we get struck by the beauty. It surges in us, it steals our breath, it grips our attention in the opposite way of a train wreck. Um, and it leads us to a place of awe.
Hmm.
That's the traditional understanding of awe. Full is something that's full of awe, or awesome. And then from there, from beauty to awe, that's where all the natural impulse for worship comes. that is so other than me, that is so beautiful, that is so great. It is not me. It could never come from me. And I need to be by it. And I need to acknowledge it and share it. That's the impulse for worship, right?
Um,
And
Sorry,
it
but I just had a pop-up come up on my screen, but like Tony. So I'm just gonna say this to whomever's listening. If you need to just rewind and re-listen, that was like that's fabulous. That is earth-shattering, thoughtful consideration.
and it's all in the same physiology that powers the experience of
Mhm.
humiliation. It's beauty that makes us go, I am different for having encountered,
Mm,
right? Whether it was the look of a loved one, whether it was this moment of seeing people serve each other where they shouldn't have, where you see reconciliation where it shouldn't happen, where you see a mountain range, a sunset, like there's these moments, they're like peak experiences. And when we encounter those, our whole physiology changes.
yeah,
And with that physiological change, our chemistry changes and
yeah,
our brain rewires itself bit by bit. For the amount of time we spend in the chemistry change and revisit and revisit and revisit, our brain really rewires ourselves.
yeah.
And
I
it's
think
an
like
integrated experience.
we call it like flashbulb memories. So we used to say, "Where were you when you found out Lady Diana died, or the
Yep.
towers fell?" Or
Yep.
now we say, "Where were you when you found out that Trump was president again?" Like these
Yep.
flashbulb memories.
Yep.
And oftentimes we use that term with trauma or difficult things, but then there's the other space. And so sometimes when I'm working with people who live above their shoulders, I'll talk about creating snapshots, mental snapshots with your mind. So
Yeah.
I'll meet with a woman who's gonna get married or a couple who's gonna get married and say, on your wedding day, I want you to find spots to get slow and take a mental snapshot with your mind. It's gonna go by fast.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
it's those things like when we're dysregulated, all of our lids are a little bit flipped right now. Again, we're not going to talk about why,
Yeah.
but everybody's not doing as well as we usually do. This is a time to like get slow and be present and take a mental snapshot with our mind. When you're talking about those healing spots on the other side of making difficult decisions for our betterment, some of it is like, I think having like you and me, our friendship, and
Yeah.
having Tony, whose story is a little bit different than mine, but I hear Tony's story and I'm like, oh, I'm not a fucking loser. Oh, there's one more, there's another person. And then
Solidarity.
there's more and there's more and there's more. And we find people that we're not going to group think and be toxic. We don't think toxically about what's behind us and what's before us.
Gratitude, if at all possible.
The gratitude, and I really liked who I was in my old belief system. She was wrong about some things. She made lots of mistakes, but I liked her.
She was trying to be integrated as best she knew.
Yeah, and she comes along with me.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't get rid of those parts. Our parts we don't erase. We may feel erased when we exit um a system, whether that's our family, a marriage, a church, a
Yeah.
difficult place, a job. We might feel erased when we go, but we're not erased.
It's so interesting. It's only really in modernity that we really have as deep and formal of a sense of individuality that we
Oh
do.
yeah.
And modernity is really recent in the human experience. If you think about how long humans have been around, and I don't care really what theory you subscribe to for how long we've been around, doesn't make a difference. Either way, modernity, you can point that to maybe 200 years post-Enlightenment, 1800s. Right? You can maybe point at it about that far back, maybe a little bit further, but not really that far. And whether you think people have been around 6,000, 12,000, 120,000, who knows how long, how many years? Sorry, 200. And the majority of human experience, as far as we've been able to assess it from archaeology, and I like those kinds of things, has been very different. Our identity has really always been derivative of our family, whose name we bear, and the village and the town and the city and the place we were in were known relative to each other.
Yeah.
And we know ourselves in that experience. But when I'm working with clients, there's something that's really interesting that emerges is we in the body dynamic system, we talk about something called the ego aspects.
Mhm.
Now, let me make that really concrete because that's lofty sounding. It's the ways we know ourselves, but in different domains. And the first domain is always physical because we're born. We don't have abstract reasoning when we're born, as far as we're aware. Nobody remembers it, right? So we're born and what do we sense? Well, a whole hell of a lot of like, it's too bright, it's too cold. Where's my umbilical cord? Like, it's air and like, what's going on? It's just, ugh, it's an assault to the senses. Birth is a little traumatic to the senses in that regard, to small t. Um, but then we build on top of that, and we get a sense of like, hey, it feels really good to have warmth. And I like this kind of warmth. I like this kind of texture. I don't like that kind of texture. And then on top of that body ego, we develop a sense of individuality. The way I like doing this with clients is I like saying, do you like vanilla or chocolate ice cream? I like chocolate. Well, vanilla is clearly better than chocolate. Yeah, right. There's no way of saying that. So it's an individuality that doesn't have um, a better or worse to it. It's just this is me. This is what I like and this is what I don't like. Those two layers of experience go underneath our role egos. And for a lot of us, those two layers fall away when we go to school. And then we
Mm.
think of ourselves as good students, good brothers, good sisters, or bad. And that's also role identification. I have to be
Yes.
the bad one. This is consistent with being the bad one. I take on a job, I take on a volunteer position. I'm known in my group as the fill in the blank. And when that's the only thing that we develop our experience and our way of knowing ourselves in, when that's taken away and we don't have a robust relationship with our body ego or our
Mm.
individual ego, the trauma becomes so much worse. And
I
role
am,
egos are powerful. They are how we survive trauma
yeah.
more often than not.
Yeah, like I am what I do. I am how people see me. I
Yeah.
am how I help you to be more like me or what the ideals are that I believe in. So let
Yeah.
me ask you a question. And it's just like, I had
Yep.
this question. I'm like, this is kind of the perfect time to ask it. I'm not trying to
Totally.
get you to say anything you don't want to say. But when we're talking about, you know, chocolate or vanilla ice cream and the individuality,
Mhm.
so often I've been having this conversation with people lately about the God that you know.
Yeah.
And what do you think about this? And I want to know from you because I trust so much of what we learn together. Like, does it matter what we call God?
The only things people really willingly die for are things they can't directly see. So people die over that question, right? They don't die for earning a couple extra bucks here or there. Not usually.
Not
But
usually.
if people are willing to die for anything, it's actually usually the answer to that question. So it's a big question. The way I understand it, being a therapist, is there's theology that helps us be more human, or there's ways of having theology that help us be more human.
Yeah.
And there's ways of theology that distance us from our humanity. Maybe they throw us extra hard into like rad trad roles. And that can be really powerful for surviving institutional traumas, right? They kind of tend to often go together, not always. But if theology makes it harder for us to be fully human, then it does have an impact on how we view God,
Yeah.
right? That's why I make any changes I do within my own faith journey is excuse me, I'm trying to land in a place where hopefully I'm not always right. Because how do I
Yeah.
know who God is, right? But am I in a place that actually gives evidence to me being more present with people,
Hmm.
with myself, and being able to do what's necessary to be in better, more whole person connection with people?
Yeah.
Does the theology support that, or does it get in the way of that? And then with my limited knowing, how can I assess that?
Yeah. Does
Does
my
that make
theology,
that answer?
I love it. I'm like, that's better than what I loved it. I don't have a better answer than what I've heard you just say, that doesn't matter what we call God. And you say people are willing to die for that question or for that dilemma, that way of being. And I think that's better than the answer I had before, which is I don't know and it doesn't matter to me. But there's a sacredness in the question, and there is a sacredness in honoring the inclusiveness of divine love and the inclusiveness. Your answer holds inclusiveness better than just I don't know,
Hmm.
is what I'd say. And
Well,
then I feel proud of you when you say smart things. I do, because it's like I'm kind of like I learn so much from you, and in a weird way, it's like I'm like kind of like a mentor to you, but I'm like, how am I your mentor? Because I feel so proud of you, Tony, and your wisdom, and I learn so much from you.
no, I appreciate that. I mean, not to be cheesy and on topic, but the beauty of it is that this is so mutual, and there's
Yeah,
sharing that happens, that so, like, as much as I can know about God in my own experience, I need other people. This is the fundamental idea behind church, is no one of us is enough to hold a picture of God. I actually often say this to clients, because it's fiercely practical, as good theology should be. Um, St. Paul writes a letter to the churches, and he rebukes one of them, and he has this really profound rebuke, which just rings through my ears almost every day. And he says something along the lines of, "You have many teachers,
mm,
but few fathers."
mm,
And when I look at the kids that I'm raising in this world, I say, well, why would he talk about fathers plural? And then I put my son to bed at night, and I look at him and I say, "Forgive me, a sinner. I was not the dad you needed me to be today,
mm.
because I screwed this up. I'm not mad, or I'm not going to apologize for getting angry about the things that weren't working. I'm going to apologize for how I got angry, because I don't want you to
Yeah,
take me
yeah. That's
on."
attachment-based parenting too. We
And
can say
and
sorry.
yeah, oh, absolutely. I have to be able to see my own limits. And then I look at the peers I have in my community, and I say, when I'm the one screwing things up, will my son have somebody else to model the gap from? Will somebody else be able to pick up my slack as I pick up their slack?
And that's the body of Christ, that we are intended to, the spiritual metaphor of the body of Christ,
Mhm.
is this in collective culture, that if my from a attachment perspective, if my number one isn't there, my number two isn't there, and if I have a number three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine,
Yep.
like
Yeah.
I have many fathers.
Yeah. And each of them
Yeah,
sees something different of me, but together they see me. And together through them, I can be more fully seen. And it's interesting because you look at the Geneva War Crimes Conventions. That's a funny pivot,
this
right?
is where we're going. This is where we're going.
And one of the things that's considered a crime is solitary confinement.
Mm,
And yet we have a culture right now that's promoting the juiciest kinds of solitary confinement possible. And the result is a very first world problem,
yeah,
is that we are in a crisis of meaninglessness, and we are despairing while we're having food hand delivered by Skip and having an endless display of media entertainment. And it's like, that's not seeing me. It's not
that's
making me more human.
I yeah, and what neural pathways are dying off in my brain?
Yeah.
What am I, I think about this often. I think that's part of why I do social media, is I want to get people to pause in a different direction.
Yeah.
That it's like, I don't know, maybe this will just be bullshit and like some fluff pretend, oh yeah, I pretended to know something, but maybe somebody else is going to be able to access in to feel encouraged to find further psychological healing and spiritual healing, or spiritual healing and then psychological healing, like
Yeah.
they're and both.
Yeah.
Okay, so we don't have lots of time, but I have another, like, because I love talking about co-regulation.
Hmm.
And I wanted to lean into that space with you because there is this spiritual dance between self-regulation and co-regulation as a
Yes.
spiritual discipline. We know it
Yep.
as a psychological necessity, somatic or attachment wise. And you and I actually have never talked about this, but we're nerds cut from a similar cloth. So I'm
Yeah.
thinking Tony's thought about this. It's kept him up at night.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think about that? Like what I call self-regulation and co-regulation
Oh.
in the body of Christ, in
Ooh.
my spiritual identity. What do you think?
Ooh. Okay. Yeah. Maybe I have thought about it before. Maybe I haven't. It's all just coming together right now. I don't know. Um, I'm gonna go object relations on you for a moment, right? And part of the task of parenting a child is them internalizing the parent object.
Mm,
Right? So when the parent co-regulates the child enough, the child internalizes that process of co-regulation. And they never really self-regulate so much as they relate to that process.
yeah.
And they can do it without the parent being physically present, but it's because the parent was present, they can do it. They were able to internalize it. They made enough experiences that they can recall the experience,
Yes.
right? And that recalled experience is an actual, real, state-changing experience.
Yeah.
Now, if you put that in the context of faith, none of the problems we faced haven't been faced before. C.S. Lewis has a good thing about this, actually. He has a thing he says where for every new book you read an old book because the problems we faced are similar and you might find that they've been solved at a different time from a different perspective. And then it's different enough that you can actually pay attention to it. And one of the things I love about the tradition I've landed in now is that, unlike the way I grew up, it actually places a value, even a premium, on prayers written by people that have made real experiences with God. And among myself and a lot of peers who are also converts, we always have this conversation where we go like, man, I was really dealing with this thing. And then there's this prayer written by so and so from such and such a time, and I read it and it gave me, I'm putting this in my own language now. It gave me a different vocabulary for making sense of my experience of
Yeah.
depression or despair or fear for my child or what have you. And if it was just me on my own, my language wasn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
But because somebody else wrestled through this and had different resources, I can borrow it from them. And
Yeah.
through that kind of a relationship, we actually co-regulate.
Yes. Yeah. And it is, like that internalized other
Hmm.
co-regulating in. And I think, I hear you saying that. This is part of why we're seeing this exit from these evangelical, more fun churches. Fun is what we would have thought, to
Yep.
the liturgical, because the liturgy, this is so nerdy, and I'll say it and then we can make it more palatable. The liturgy helps us to enter into the great cloud of witnesses. The
Yeah.
church calendar is like the feast we feast today has been the feast for hundreds of years, and everybody celebrated it together on this day. And we're all in the body together in that. So when we start to really
Yeah.
embody the liturgy, because we can do the liturgy from just in our heads, anybody can be stuck in their head,
Yep.
but when we're
Yep.
indwelling and we are in the grand collective of our
Mhm.
spiritual anthropology. Can we say that?
I don't think there's anything more real than that.
Okay.
It's only until the 1950s that up until then, we didn't really have a clear understanding. that was the clearest understanding we had of genetics.
Mm-hmm.
There was some stuff going back, like those Punnett squares and all that stuff was developed a lot longer before that. But prior to that, most of human history was really, do you break the bread the same way as me? Do you wash yourself the same way as me? We share our rituals, we're the same family.
Yeah.
You read through the entire Old Testament, that's the function of it. Do you do my rituals or not? And if you
Okay.
do, you're my family.
Yeah, and I have a client and we live that life. So I want to ask you a question and I'll answer it too.
Yeah.
So let's pick two books that we're going to tell people about. When we're thinking about the inner spiritual journey and the wisdom, one
Mm.
old book and one new book.
Mm. Oh, now you're making me think here.
Hmm.
I haven't been reading much since I had kids, so I'm going on stuff that I had from 5, 6 years ago.
Okay, I'll go first and you can listen and think because I
Yeah,
trust you can do both.
yeah.
So I'm like diehard Thomas Merton fan,
Mm.
and I find him palatable. Seven Story Mountain. Don't. That's not what I'm gonna say. Pick something easier. Don't pick 1,000-page book is my suggestion.
That's what I'm thinking about because I like reading my big
I
tomes.
know. So The
It
Inner
was a quick introduction.
Experience by Thomas Merton, I would say for an older book, that's like 1960s. Actually, if you want to get political, it's hard to find, but Christian or Peace in a Post-Christian Era by Thomas Merton, very hard to find, but timely.
Mm.
However,
Interesting.
for the purpose of like juxtapositioning the old, how do I embrace my spiritual growth, and the new, the inner experience, Thomas Merton. New book. I've read so many good new theology books, and the one I just can't stop referring people to is William Paul Young's Lies We Believe About God. I think
Mm.
it's easy. It's like this
Even by
makes
title,
sense.
that's profound, right?
It makes sense.
Yeah,
It's not rocket science how he lays it out. You can read it
yeah,
and consider what you agree or disagree with Paul about. So
yeah.
my two, Tony, you got a couple books?
So my recent one, I think if it's going to be on theme for what we talked about today, right when I was going through my undergrad studies leading into grad studies on cultural competency. I had to bring that back into my faith life, right? And there's a book written by an expat missionary that was in Lebanon for a long time, an American missionary in Lebanon. And one of the challenges he had to face in his work was that he was dealing with a country that actually has a really ancient Christian tradition, but it also has the ancient Middle Eastern cultural traditions alongside it. So it's a really interesting mixing pot. And coming in as an American to a Middle Eastern country, he came up with some really challenges, particularly as a missionary. And he had to wrestle with the fact that this was actually the birthplace of the Abrahamic religions, and that the
Mm,
culture they were received in and transmitted from was a Middle Eastern culture.
yeah.
So he wrote a book called Grace for Shame that was kind of the thing that really started to open my eyes. And he talked about how he really had to wrestle with the fact that in an honor and shame culture, which is the context that the main scriptures of the world were written in, not not to uh, not acknowledge the traditions from India and Asia. Um, But in those particular contexts, so much of scripture doesn't make sense from a Western world
Mm,
because so much of Western Christianity is Western, and we are living on the other side of the Enlightenment and merit,
mm,
not honor and shame cultures, is how
yeah.
we, at least the pretense we have for our culture. So there's so much we deal with in daily life where we don't have a vocabulary for the daily experience of shame. But if we do, we read scripture differently. And he had an exercise. So the book's called Grace for Shame by John A. Forrester with two R's.
You'll give me the spell. I'll get the spelling from you.
Sure.
Put it down below.
And he to kind of put it right in, he says, go to Safeway, and then go to your local Lebanese market and try to figure out your way around both of them.
Mm,
And both of them are selling you groceries, but they're organized and they understand themselves very differently. And you're
what a
going to be
metaphor.
very lost in one and super familiar, too familiar in the other. You can ignore most of the other because you're so familiar with it.
I love it.
So that's the recent book, Grace for Shame by John A. Forrester. As for an old book, oh, like what's old? How old do we want to go? Want to go like
Well, I went like 60s, 50s, 60s, so not that old.
um hmm. That's the one I really struggle with because it's like I could go between 50 to like 1800 years. Um 1800 wouldn't work because there's so much context that needs to happen before you can understand 1800-year-old English translations. Um
Good thing I asked you this question, Tony, because you need an answer.
I do need an answer. My goodness, on the spot. You know what? I might say something from C.S. Lewis books.
Oh, that sounds amazing. What'd you pick?
Um, either The Great Divorce
Mm.
or, and I mean, if you're a secular person listening to this, there's still a lot of metaphorical value in it for understanding internal processes, is the Screw Tape Letters.
Oh,
Because
it,
I've talked with a lot of people, and it's a well-known title, but not many people have read it. And it's so profound to think about this internal
yeah.
struggle set up as a bureaucracy, an institution, if you will.
Yeah, read it as a metaphor or listen to it. It's a great book on Audible
Oh,
or
is it?
audio. Yeah,
Okay.
so just even as a metaphor. The other thing in this really crazy kind of tense political time, all of our lids are a little bit flipped.
Yeah. Oh,
So Thomas Merton's Peace in a Post-Christian Era, C.S. Lewis's The Weight of Glory.
ooh,
Fabulous. He wrote
whoa.
it in war times. Fabulous book. So, okay.
That context, the writing that came after World War I and World War II, the experiences people were writing for, it's perfect for lid flip days like today.
Yeah. So, and then Tony, if you think of any other books, we'll put some stuff down below. Tony and my info, if you want it. Tony's not big on social media, but I know where to find him. If you can't find him, you can find me, and I can find Tony. Well, I adore you. I'm so thankful that you are my brother. I'm so thankful for the hours we spent walking the same hallways and just the um continued friendship that we've had to this point. And I just am so thankful for you as a friend on the trail.
Oh, Tara, it's been so mutual. It's been such a rich journey.
Awesome. Okay. Peace.